Boker Tov L'kulam. We hope you have downloaded your source sheets for today's session. Reb Zalman reminded us that as rabbis, we need to engage with the Halakah. And he said, while it's true that scripture states, Zechor Yomot Olam, Uvinu Shnot Dor V'Dor, remember the days of antiquity, and those days, he said, have an aspect of permanence and continuance. It is also written. Okay, so well, it's true that scripture states, remember the days of antiquity, Zechor Yomot Olam. It also says, Binu Shnot Dor V'Dor. And he said there's a change that occurs in and he takes the word shnot and he says it's don't read shnot, read hishtanut. If we take for granted that there are big changes that have occurred on the level of paradigm shift, does that also mean, or does that not also mean there should be changes in halakha? And his answer is yes, and our answer is yes. And that is the core of integral halakha. Rabbi SaraLeya and I were ordained by Reb Daniel to continue the halachic, the study of halakha through Aleph in the integral halakha Deni, along with Rabbi Hannah Dresner, who's not here with us today. And so we have three newly spucht rabbis who are going to be sharing their Torah with us.
So today our integral halakha panel has to do with topics that are ethically relevant today and how halakha can be integrated, the halachic process can be integrated into our thinking about these ethical issues. I will offer a very brief frame for ways that you can potentially think about the three presentations and potentially integrate them. The way today's process will go is that we'll have the presentation for about 20 minutes by each of our rabbis on topics that they studied in the last 2 years of their Simcha studies. And then we'll have time for questions and answers, questions and responses afterwards. So in being inspired by the work that these three and their other colleagues have all done in their studies of integral halakha, when I brought the possibility of bringing them to this panel to our group of Dayanim, which I consider to be placeholders for halakha within our movement. I don't consider myself as any kind of Dayanet in any way, but a placeholder, because the study of halakha excites me and I find it to be invigorating, and I love having that rear view mirror constantly of well, what was in their minds, like what were they thinking about? You know, it's just so, to me, it's very intellectually and spiritually exciting to study halakha. And I want to, when I brought this topic, I want to thank Simcha Daniel for, he immediately came up with the exact frame that would help integrate this panel. And so you'll see on your topics, you can move down a little bit on the sheet. You'll see on your topics, there's two issues in halakha that I wanted to bring as a frame for us to think about the discussion today. The first comes from the very, very, very beginning of Pirkei Avot, like the absolute beginning. We hear the Masorah of the tradition, and then what do the Anshe Knesset Hagadol, what do they have to say? They say, Hevu metunim badim, be deliberate, slow, patient, considerate, balanced, maybe loving in your judging. And of course, they are referring to the process of being in a Beit Din, being in a rabbinical court. But of course, for us, the idea of judging is relevant to us as we walk through life. Without judging, judgment often gets a hard rap in the sense of being judgmental, but discernment is essential to our ability to live lives of quality and intention. And I think we can get a little bit of a Kabbalistic lesson from our beloved tree of life as we think of Din, Dayanim, Din, as holding the unbounded chesed and meeting, of course, in the place of heart, in the place of emet, another name for the Sphira of Tiferet. And that maybe is what Din Matun is. Maybe balanced judgment is that place of holding the love in a container of judging, of balanced judging, and finding that place of truth for each of us, as we do, as we were instructed by our beloved teacher yesterday, Jill, which is to center ourselves both in the dimension of the six directions, in the dimension of the present moment, and the dimension of ourselves. It's another, I'm going to try to bring that into thinking about integral halakha as like we continue to unfold what it might mean. So that's the first frame, Hevu, metunim, badin. The second frame that Simcha Daniel brought is a really interesting inyan that the rabbis discuss in at least two places regarding witnessing. And I'm not going to go into that in too much detail. I'm actually thinking that because I spent a lot of time studying it, that I might offer a little hour seminar for OHALAH sometime in a couple weeks or a month to actually look at the topic of shtika kahoda'a damya. Silence can be considered as admission. I don't know if those of us who were here at the Shabbaton this weekend heard Tzvika give an amazing drash and spoke about Yehuda and the word of lehodot, the verb lehodot. That's two meanings. We're always used to lehodot Lashem, give gratitude to God. But the other meaning, which is equally important, is that of confession. The word vidui comes from the same shorash. And so it's not that that silence is like gratitude. I guess it could be, but silence is considered as an admission. And the rabbis raise this as a question. And you'll see in your source sheets for you to look at later on, it's quite a complicated discussion. And what I ask you to consider today, just on your own, without looking at all the rabbinic sources, is how do we bring that concept of silence being as admission into this discussion that we're going to hear in three different ways today. There are situations when it is clear that silence is an admission of culpability. And there are also times when the correct response is unclear, or when silence may be the appropriate way to respond to a complex situation. So we'll allow this to unfold in all of our minds today as we hear from each of our amazing new rabbis. And we'll begin with Rabbi Alan Levin. Did I get that right? I got it right. Okay, yeah. Who in his he wrote one paper for his Teshuvah class, and then he went even further in his capstone project to bring something really relevant to us about being a rabbi in the boardroom. So,
thank you. Well, good morning. I'm delighted to be here. Can everyone hear me? No? Okay. Okay. So I'm delighted to be here, and my capstone paper, The Rabbi in the Boardroom, was really focused on how, with all the rabbinic values and preparation and training and philosophy, how does that show up for me in a public company board meeting for dealing with secular issues in corporate governance. And by way of background, I sit on the board of directors of two public companies in the pharmaceutical industry. So for me, it was a merging of both my secular and my rabbinic stories. When I think about the responsibilities of a director for a public company in the United States, I think there are four principal areas, and I've used a four worlds model to try and frame that out. There are operational considerations, the day-to-day running of the corporation, and that's a very ASEA orientation. And here, a director is really asked for oversight, advice, insight, but we are one step removed from management in terms of the day-to-day oversight of the corporation. Then there's the Yetzirah Dika piece of it, which is the people considerations. And that can range through fair and competitive compensation, mentoring, succession planning for key executives, the corporate culture, diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is very topical in the boardroom right now. There's also an element of deep thinking as it relates to strategic planning for the corporation, and that's the Berea orientation of a director's responsibilities. And then finally, there's the spiritual and ethical considerations, the Atzilut element. This could be drawn from regulatory considerations from the Securities and Exchange Committee, codes of conduct, whistleblower programs for unethical conduct by the corporation, or other regulatory considerations in areas like manufacturing, for example. So if you think about the modern corporation, there are a number of stakeholders. There are investors or shareholders, there are employees, there are customers, there are suppliers, there are communities where goods and services are produced and sold, there are regulators, and there are governments. And there are really two models of shareholder governance in the United States. The primary model is a shareholder model, where the shareholders' interests, the interests of stockholders in that corporation, are primary. And that has been the dominant model of corporate governance for quite some time. But the alternative model is what I call a stakeholder model. And here, these other stakeholders of the corporation, those interests are balanced in a more nuanced and careful way against the expectations of investor shareholders. And there is a rising trend in the US to broaden boardroom perspectives, both in terms of greater representation of women, people of color, the LGBTQIA community, in terms of who sits in the boardroom, and also efforts to raise issues that are important for some of those key stakeholders in the corporation itself. But notwithstanding that, the US is still a very shareholder-centric in its legal structure. And so there is this tension between trying to accommodate the multiplicity of stakeholder interests in a legal system that favors shareholders. So the Jewish tradition has a lot to say about navigating and balancing this diverse web of interconnected stakeholder interests in meaningful and dynamic ways. A rabbi brings a moral and ethical lens on significant decisions that are made at the top of the corporation. Clergy bring a balance of head and heart, which can be very helpful when a company is perhaps underappreciating the human considerations of a difficult decision. There's mentoring that board members provide to senior executives, and the interpersonal dynamics of an executive's role and pastoral counseling perspective can be very important there. I think there are 4 key principles for a director to bear in mind that come from our tradition. The first is Dina de Malchuta Dina, and I draw your attention to the first source on page 3 from Baba Kama 113b. And this is the law of the land is the law. And so if we are going to participate in secular spaces, it's important to understand the secular laws that govern in those spaces. And so that's a framing principle for sitting in those spaces. The second is lifnim mishorat hadin, to go beyond the letter of the law, and that is from Bava Metzia 30b, the bottom of page 3 of your source sheet. And here, I want to cite in particular the last piece of this source in English. It was taught in the Baraita, they must perform. That is referring to acting beyond the letter of the law, as Rabbi Yochanan says. Jerusalem was destroyed only for the fact that they adjudicated cases on the basis of Torah law in the city. The Gemara asks, rather, what else should they have done? Should they rather have adjudicated cases on the basis of arbitrary decisions? Rather say that they established their rulings on the basis of Torah law and did not go beyond the letter of the law. And so scripture doesn't articulate how we should act in each and every situation that we may encounter. And we have to take it upon ourselves to act in accordance with our own understanding of a high moral standard. The next piece is what I call a covenantal mindset. And here I looked at the stories of Abraham and Yitzchak with Avimelech, the king of Philistia, in Bereshit 21 and 26 as a model in this regard, to look at covenants between people. And here, these stories have to deal with securing natural resources, water, for an extended period of time, and living in communities with neighbors in peace for an extended period of time. So when you look at the nature of those covenants that are articulated in the Torah, what you see is that they are between long-lived counterparties. Abraham lived for 175 years, Yitzchak 180. I might argue that that's analogous to the long life of a modern corporation. They were built on trust, transparency, open and honest dealing. They were guided by an expansive sense of chesed, but they were also built on law and contractual obligations to minimize conflict. And that's the din or gevura aspect of it. And so to be successful, there had to be a balance of that chesed and gevura. And so that balanced judging that SaraLeya referenced, I think I see in that covenantal mindset. So who's in covenant? I think a modern corporation is in covenant with all of its stakeholders. And adopting that covenantal mindset puts you into a frame of mind about how you ought to be dealing with all of the interested parties with whom you're doing business over an extended period of time. It implies that the corporation should be nurturing those relationships in long-term sustainable ways. And to do otherwise takes me to my fourth source from Leviticus 19:14, is michshol lifnei iver, putting a stumbling block before the blind. So if I believe that as a director, that I'm in covenant with other people and the corporation is in covenant with other people, and I believe that my fellow directors are in covenant with other people, other stakeholders, and I don't speak up in the boardroom on an important issue, then I'm putting a stumbling block before the blind. And so maybe that's an aspect of this question of when is silence appropriate and when is silence not appropriate that we talked about in framing this out. So in my capstone paper, I applied these principles in a situation in which a pharmaceutical company is setting the price of a new drug that's been approved by regulatory authorities, and the pricing is being discussed with the board of directors. And there are several considerations to work through in that issue. What would be a fair price? Number one. Number two, should the price be fixed solely by free market competition, or should there be some type of price that's set by the community? Number three, new drugs are patented, but what does our tradition say about intellectual property? Four, patents give rise to monopolies for a period of time. How does the tradition view an economic monopoly? And number five, drugs often address previously unmet medical need. So how does the concept of pekuach nefesh play into other halachic concepts that are involved in drug pricing? So in a nutshell, given the time constraints, my conclusions were that pharmaceutical products are essential products, articles on which our lives depend, to quote from my sixth source, which is the top of page 5 of your source sheet, Mishneh Torah Hilchot Mechira 14. These essential products should have a standard value that one charges in normal times as well as in times of duress, which is based on the Shulchan Aruch Yoredea 336.3. The best analog for what a community is today is the nation state that has a government-sponsored health program, like the G7 nations of Western Europe or Canada, Japan, for example. Halakhah struggles with the value of intellectual property. Maimonides and the Shulchan Aruch talk about דבר שאין בו ממש, אין קניין מועיל בו. So essentially, and this is source number 8, the top of page 6, Shulchan Aruch Choshen Mishpat 203.1. Essentially, you can't sell something that is an intangible item. That is what's in the Shulchan Aruch. But the principle of Dina de Malchuta Dina argues that we should respect intellectual property in countries that have established intellectual property rights as a matter of civil law. So this is a really interesting example of Choshen Mishpat meeting the modern information economy. And over the centuries, more and more of our sages came to this conclusion as rabbis themselves developed intellectual property in the form of copyrights on their writings. The tradition also has an ambivalent view of monopolies. On the one hand, competition vis-a-vis someone who had an established monopoly on a good or service was viewed as a theft of livelihood and should therefore be prevented. On the other hand, competition is pro-consumer.
Next source down.
And should be encouraged. And this is all three of the next sources, Bava Batra 21b. All three of those you see this back and forth among the sages about should we allow competition, should we not allow competition, whether it was domestic competition or even foreign competition to some extent. In Pekuach Nefesh, which is the top of page 7, Yoma 82a, talks about, so Pekuach Nefesh should trump Halakha concepts about fair pricing and monopolistic protections. But that being said, drug development results in new medicines that ultimately lose their patent protections and the premium pricing that goes with it, and they go on to help generations of people. So when it comes to Pekuach Nefesh, there is a near-term versus a long-term consideration in the development of new medicines that needs to be assessed. So a fair price for a new medicine, in my view, in the US, would be the average of the price charged in the other G7 nations, nations that have a fixed price for a nation state or community, Western Europe, Canada, and Japan. US prices are typically 75% or more higher than that average ex-US price. But lowering the US wholesale price does not guarantee that the patient will pay less for the prescription, because those savings to the insurer could be reallocated elsewhere by the insurance company. So an alternative would be to take the difference between the US price and the European price and think of it as a tzedakah fund in which the pharmaceutical company offers co-payment assistance to lower the out-of-pocket spend to the patient. Now, some companies do offer co-payment assistance to patients, but I would argue that much more could be done with this concept. And if you did it that way with this tzedakah fund, you could make the drugs free for people without insurance. You could reduce the copay to 0 if possible for people with insurance. And you could partner with NGOs, non-government organizations, to provide free drug product to patients in countries without intellectual property protections. So this is an example of reducing profits to provide greater drug access and benefit to patients. And the rabbi here in the boardroom is counseling his or her fellow board members to see themselves in a covenantal relationship with patients and their communities, as well as investors. And to take steps, going above and beyond, to make new medicines more accessible and affordable, to optimize the value of the new medicine, defining value in both financial and non-financial terms. So the rabbi speaks up in the boardroom, reminding others of their covenantal relationship with patients and their communities, because not doing so would be michshol lifnei iver, placing a stumbling block before the blind. So, thank you.
Well,
Our next presenter is Rabbi Deni Marshall, who, is going to speak to us about a very, very relevant topic, cancel culture, and will frame that for us. She's going to work from a PowerPoint, I believe. Yeah. Okay.
I have a PowerPoint. Yes.
The sources start, however, on page
So-
8.
Yeah, there are more in your sources than are up there. So you'll have more if you look at that. And I'll just kind of do this when I want to go to the next one. Thank you, everybody. It's wonderful to see you. This was not my capstone project. If you're interested in my capstone project, I have a card on my table out there and you can talk to me for more information. But I really did enjoy working on this. So in the integral Halakhah class with Rabbi SaraLeya, I wrote a mini response on the topic of call out culture and whether confronting someone on social media for something they said is a valid way to hold them accountable or not, according to Jewish Halakah. Now we know that the Me Too movement began this process of using social media to hold people accountable and was very effective. So there is nothing in what I'm going to talk about today that negates the importance of that. And I want to be clear about that. However, we know also that using social media can result in shaming and even what we call canceling a person simply for something they have said or beliefs they hold. And this topic, I think it's very important for rabbis and clergy of all kind because congregants look to us for guidance in such matters. And the answer is not clear cut for a number of reasons that we'll see today. And because of this, we really need to know how our ethical teachings have guided us for centuries so we can figure out how they apply today in the 21st century where social media is not going to disappear. So slide 2. Oh, here we are. So the scenario I created was, the question was, a woman comes to me, Rabbi, and poses this question. I was in a meeting where the leader of the project I was working on made some comments that seemed to me to be really sexist and made me feel uncomfortable. And I didn't feel comfortable confronting the head of the meeting. So I went on social media and discussed what happened with others. And I actually got some response back from other people that had also felt the same way. So was I wrong to do this as a Jew in our community? And I broke this down into 5 halachic categories. Halakha, rebuke, halvin panaim, shaming, lashon hara, evil speech, kavod habriut, human dignity, and mechae ziburit, public protest. Now, beginning with rebuke, there are many places in our sacred teachings where rebuke is discussed, many, many more than I could put up here today. So I've chosen a few to share today. And this quote from Proverbs, beginning right with the Torah here, is so powerful, equating giving rebuke with the very essence of God's commandments and Torah and the path of life. And it states that the goal of rebuke is to bring ethical guidance. The way to life is the rebuke that provides ethical guidance. So moving on, and they already did, thank you. So we go to Mishnah and Talmud, Pirkei Avot. We see that greater is Torah learning than the priesthood or royalty, and in Torah exists the love of rebuke. And Rav said the world was created through 10 attributes. It lists them. And included in that, again, is rebuke. So the next slide. We have here again, Talmud. Rabbi Hanina said Jerusalem was destroyed only because the people did not rebuke one another. So the importance of rebuke cannot be denied. And we need to ask ourselves, who is it better for? Some might say that it's better for both parties. It's better for the one who rebukes because they're not withholding their authenticity and are acting for a positive change. It's better for the one who is rebuked because if someone calls you out, they want and expect better from you, as one of my sources said. Right? Better is revealed rebuke than concealed love. And if only it was that simple, right? As another one of the sources in my paper said, in theory, call out culture should be a simple tool for positive change. Someone does something wrong, people tell them, they avoid doing it again in the future. And you should laugh, right? Because you know it doesn't happen that way. So the original goal was to hold people accountable for their actions. But the use of calling out became for some a way of mass shaming and ostracizing the person in question. So what do our teachings have to say about shaming? Next slide, please. To follow it here. So in Leviticus, we see Leviticus and we see Rashi on Leviticus, right? You shall not hate your kinsfolk in your heart. Surely reprove your kin, but do not bear sin on their account. And Rashi says, do not whiten his face in public. Although rebuking him shall not expose him to shame in public, in which case you will bear the sin on account of him. So Rashi is interpreting this to mean, don't shame or humiliate someone in public. If you shame someone while delivering your rebuke, you bring sin upon yourself. So from this, we're learning that the negative mitzvot, to not shame another, is considered as great as the positive mitzvot, to rebuke one who deserves it. Next slide. And then in Bava Metzia, we have more here in Talmud and Maimonides. So all who descend to Gehinnom ascend except for three. And out of those three, we have the one who shames his friend in public and the one who calls his friend a bad name. And Maimonides gives this guidance on rebuke and shaming and says one needs to give rebuke in private, one-to-one, for their good in order to bring them to life in the world to come. So even though they didn't have social media back in those days, they still had a concept of public shaming. And when people lived in really small communities, the effect of public shaming was, could be considered as powerful as social media is today in our spread out communities. So we need to really, take these into account and pay attention to them. Number 9, going on with more comments about this. This is keeping silent or not. So, so if rebuke is for the good, but speaking out brings shaming, should I remain silent or not? And I wanted to know what our tradition had to say on this. And there isn't consensus throughout the ages. The Talmud says to remain silent if you know the advice will not be received well and listened to. And this anonymous writer in medieval Spain says just the opposite very strongly. We shame the sinner in public, publicize his sin and insult him until he returns to the better. I'm not sure that he'll return to the better. By the way, I don't have a set answer. So this is, we'll get to an end of this and then you get to discuss it, right? So next slide, please. In our tradition, speaking negatively about someone is known as lashon hara, or evil speech. And we're not talking about lies, but truths that are said to others about someone. There are many teachings against lashon hara, beginning with Torah. Life and death are in the power of the tongue. Mavet v'chaim b'yad lashon. And then in Leviticus, don't stand on the blood of your friend. And Rashi's commentary equates this with lashon hara and gossip, rechelut. Next slide, please. In the 19th century, the Hofetz Chaim, I apologize, I never know how to turn that off here, created an entire book focused on lashon hara. And he says here, if while shaming one's friend, one honors oneself, they transgress a negative commandment and lose their place in the world to come. And he kind of explains here, you know, it's about true words, not false words. And it's about how it should be done. You know, it's sinful even if it's done in private to one other person, but how much more so to two. And he couldn't even imagine how many people we could reach today. And his concept here is, if it's more than one person, it'll be more greatly scorned in their eyes. And this is what we're seeing on social media today, because the more, you know, people in social media, the more it reaches out to and people see this, it reinforces their beliefs. Next slide, please. And then we need to look at human dignity. Where does human dignity feed in here? And whose dignity? The one being spoken about, or the one who felt demeaned by the person in the first place? And Bereshit says, right, we know this, and God created human in God's image, but B'Tselem Elohim. And then in Shabbat, a number of places in the Talmud, these passages, and they're in your sources, state that the human dignity supersedes a negative precept of the Torah. And in another place in the Talmud, it doesn't go that far. It says that human dignity overrides the prohibition of a rabbinic law, but not Torah. So they didn't have consensus. Next slide, please. But then we also have to take into account public protest. What does our tradition say? Not a lot. But here in Talmud, we see it's talking about sinful behavior, and that we need to ask, if someone is speaking in a way that is demeaning to someone else or to a group, is that not sinful? It doesn't respect the human dignity of that person or group, and it doesn't recognize the image of God in them. So here it is saying, anyone who has the capability to effectively protest sinful conduct of the members in their house, and doesn't, that they should be held accountable for that and punished, and goes on for the town, and then for the world, even more so. Next slide, please. And the Hofetz Chaim, we already talked about, he focused a lot on the lashon hara, came up with a wonderful set of criteria to consider before speaking out. And so we need to determine, well, first let's look at this. We need to determine if the information is completely true, and be sure that what was said or done was really something wrong. Number 3, before telling others, speak gently to the person, one-on-one, face-to-face, about their transgression. 4, when revealing the information, don't exaggerate. 5, the intent of the person speaking out must be to correct the wrong, not out of ill will towards the offender. 6, Make sure there's no other way to correct the wrong. And 7, by relating the incident, one must not cause the offender to suffer unfair consequences. And so we still need to determine what unfair consequences are. And that may depend on what the person said or did. So there may be a need for some discernment there as well. And number 15. Great. Obviously, all the poskim from the sages of the Talmud to the Hafetz Haim in the 19th century did not have the phenomena of the internet to take into consideration. 21st century rabbis are engaging already with the, certainly not the first, right? With this issue of call out culture through the lens of the teachings I've presented and many more. So here are the thoughts of a few of them. There are many others, of course. Rav Jonathan Zirig of Torah Har Etzion reminds us that there are other poskim who take the position that in some circumstances, it is actually a mitzvah to share negative information. And in this, he is specifically referring to sharing information with a goal to protect another or others without intent to harm the transgressor. And this is typically called lashon hara leto'elet, or evil speech for the public good. But there are those who simply call it a mitzvah. And Rav Ziring goes so far as to say, we recognize that sometimes spreading information is the best way to fulfill a mitzvah. And thus we must do so, even if we can't check all of the boxes of the Hafetz Haim. Rabbi Amy Eilberg is also very concerned about the use of social media as a way of confronting another person. And she looks at both sides of it, acknowledging that the use of social media is not likely to cease. She reminds us that there are 2 mitzvot that we Jews are required to pursue, tzedek and shalom, and the energy of these 2 are very different. She says, when our principles are under attack and it is difficult to remember the other person is also B'Tselem Elohim. Thus, she says, we need to be mindful of our reactions and to, quote, arouse people for the struggle of justice and cultivate love and kindness and curiosity and respect for self and the other at the same time. Whew. Hard, very hard. And one more, Rabbi Stuart Weinblatt commented on the positive side of using social media and how, quote, the adverse negative publicity and public shaming of individuals who make hurtful statements or express heinous opinions can shine light on and draw attention to prejudices, bigotry, or stereotypes, and help render them unacceptable and obsolete. Wow, the idea that a conservative rabbi would even consider shaming as vaguely positive is testimony to the changing paradigm of 21st century thought. Seeking backward compatibility, however, he reminds us that the Jewish teachings throughout the ages urge us to be cautious with our words and to consider the feelings of others and to have awe, yirah, awe and fear of God, whether speaking privately or publicly. Last slide. With the exception of the ultra-Orthodox, we Jews of the 21st century must accept and cope with the reality of social media. We must apply the ethics we have inherited over 2,000 years to the present time in which we live. Using social media to confront someone with their behavior may not be the first choice. However, it can be powerful and positive tool if used in the right way with Yirah B'Shem Shemayim. The key to maintaining our Jewish values is to find the balance. And I'll leave you with this one more thing. Miranda Park, author of The Caveats of Call Out Culture, asks, how do we find the right balance between holding people accountable for their sexist attitudes or language, and making sure we don't become completely intolerant of others' voices and opinions. And where do we draw the line? So really, this is a question for us to really talk about, consider, and study. And it is being discussed in many circles throughout the Jewish world, as well as the non-Jewish world. And I invite you to engage in this. Thank you.
Our third new rabbi, Rabbi Kat Zavis, will speak to us about the role of the rabbi today. Kat. Her sources begin on page 13. Thank you.
And my notes. So the question that I'm exploring, and I'll put it in kind of a playful way. You're not hearing me. Okay, so yeah, now I can hear myself in my ears. In a playful way is to talk about or not to talk about politics from the bima. The exact response I was expecting. Thank you. So obviously there's a much debate about this and a lot of feelings, and it stirs up a lot for all of us. So as I talk about this and go through this, I'm going to ask you to notice your emotional reactions and responses, positive, negative, torn, uncomfortable, wanting to run out of the room, and see if you can hold that in your hearts. Because if we find that there might in fact be some halakhic obligation to speak politics from the bima, then our congregants are going to be sitting with the same feelings you're sitting with as I talk today. So this was an issue for me because those of you who've heard me speak know that I actually like to talk politics from the bima. And I really wanted to know, because I've had lots of conversations and debates with folks about, is there any halakhic permission to do so? And just so you know, this debate, I'm sure many of you have seen, is on social media, it's in our community, it's in your shuls, it's everywhere. And in 2011, a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, Tevi Troy, he criticized in the Wall Street Journal rabbis who might speak about political issues during their high holiday sermons. In response, in the Huffington Post, 3 days later, Rabbi Jill Jacobs of Trua argued that the Torah is political and rabbis can be as well. And she draws an important distinction between partisan politics and moral leadership, saying, we do not need more partisan politics, but we are in desperate need of religious moral leadership. And Rabbi Aryeh Cohen, in his book, Justice in the City, an argument from the sources of rabbinic Judaism, which is a brilliant book, writes about Martin Luther King. And he says, with clear vision and a burning soul, Martin Luther King saw the related ills of racism and poverty and violence and war, and called America out for not addressing those ills. With the prophetic cadences of his righteous rage, King walked fearlessly into the forces of evil and did not let the evil of racism hide behind the mask of our way of life. He did not let the evil of poverty hide behind the mask of business and capitalism. And he did not allow the evil of war to hide behind the mask of anti-communism. So we have to explore, like, what do I mean by political? So what I don't mean by political is arguing for a particular candidate or particular side on a particular issue, although I would venture to say that if our moral principles point us in a particular direction, perhaps we do have authority to do that, but that's not the argument I'm making today. I'm not going that far. What I'm talking about is that we have pressing moral issues of our time. Our planet's being destroyed. The gap between the wealthy and the poor is expanding, which is only going to lead to internal turmoil and civil unrest. People are starving. War is expanding. Congress just passed the largest military budget in history, only surpassing the one they passed last year. While people in my cities, at least, are on the streets in downpouring rain. So the questions I really wanted to ask, like, do we have permission to speak about politics from the Bima? And what I came to believe through my exploration was not only do we have permission, but we have an obligation. And I was surprised, but of course delighted to find that to be the case. So I'm going to start with Eliezer Berkowitz, and I think that's, yeah. So the Torah in its entirety exists for the ways of peace, and Halakah is a system by which we can embody in our daily lives and practices the ethical principles and teachings of the Torah. He says, Halakah must give priority to the ethical demand. Rabbi Jacob Agus, in a teshuvah entitled The Mitzvah of Keruv, wrote that the Torah embraces in depth and scope far more than halakha. So I'm bringing this in because I want to look at not just halakha, but the whole tenor of our entire tradition to help guide this discussion. So he says the Torah is filled with general principles and specific laws, and these principles are interpreted as general guidelines of actions and feelings by the sages of the Talmud and Midrash, who added a realm of obligation beyond the boundaries of halakha. Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, who has amazing things to say about this, the power of creative interpretation, chidush, is the very foundation of the received tradition. The world is a means for ethical manifestation and realization. Halakha is the medium through which we imagine the ideal world and attempt to concretize it in the existing world. And Zalman Schachter Shalomi and Daniel Siegel and Integral Halakha ask, how can we evolve and transform the mitzvot to make them meaningful and relevant in our historical time? And the way I take that, what I take that to mean, in other words, is what does this moment demand of us? So obviously halakha is changing. It's not as static. And integral halakha is part of that changing terrain and discussion. But what I really want to argue here is that this isn't a paradigm shifting halakhic position. If we believe that halakha must give priority to the ethical demand, then this is a halakhic obligation, not only an ethical obligation. Oh, okay. So my questions were, what roles should rabbis and Jewish spiritual leaders play in times like these? Are we to remain silent in the face of such pressing moral issues out of fear of alienating members of our congregation? What does it mean to be a Jewish spiritual leader? Is our role solely to comfort the afflicted? Or do we also have a moral responsibility to afflict the comfortable? Does our tradition give a rabbi or Jewish spiritual leader permission to address or incorporate these important social and/or political issues in liturgy, in sermons, in educational programming, or elsewhere? And is the rabbi or Jewish spiritual leader obligated to speak prophetically, even if it makes congregational members uncomfortable? May it always make congressional members uncomfortable or create tension. And as I said, what is the difference between partisan political speech and spiritual moral speech? Heschel taught, I don't know about the rest of you, but I get so dry here. It's crazy. Indifference, huh? Yeah, it's good modeling. Everyone take a breath. Indifference to evil is more insidious than evil itself. It is more universal, more contagious, more dangerous. God is not indifferent to evil. God is always concerned. I'll say God, he said he. God is personally affected by what human beings do to other human beings. So the first thing that after I kind of explored those concepts of halakha, I looked at some meta principles or moral values. Because again, I'm wanting to expand the idea of what halakha is beyond just law. There's also ethics. And as a lawyer, I also did this in my legal practice, and it also drove people crazy. So you did. Truth. Okay, so the first moral principle that I'm looking at is justice, truth, and peace. And I'm sorry, maybe some of you have it on your phone. And it's from Psalm 85:11. Loving kindness and truth meet, justice and peace kiss. Can you imagine such a day? So from this and other sources, I come to the conclusion that justice, truth, and peace are necessary interdependent building blocks for a just society. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel taught three things ensure the foundation or survival of the world: justice, truth, and peace. As it says in Zechariah, speak truth, create peace, and render true and honest judgments in your gates. The God of Israel, the one who freed us from the bonds of slavery, is the God of truth, peace, and justice. Rabbi Aaron Samuel Tamaris, who lived from 1869 to 1931, who was a radical pacifist, religious values and teachings for him are infused with political meaning and have actual power and political application. Religiosity, Heschel taught, was not only a private affair, but a public act. To truly embody the values of pursuing justice, loving peace, and speaking truth requires concrete actions. They are not private religious matters. They are deeply public and deeply political. To manifest them in our world as is required of us as Jews, we must uncover the places where they are hidden and work to make them visible and actualized. So one way we do that, of course, is in our responsibility to the stranger and the needy. So I'm on page, I can tell you, 14 of my text of the document. Yeah, beautiful, thank you. So we're all familiar with Exodus. You shall not wrong the stranger, ger, or oppress him, for you were strangers, gerim, in the land of Egypt. And then, of course, they add on, you shall not ill-treat any widow or orphan, because they have these groups of categories that we really have to watch over in our world. And then Leviticus says, love another human being, even the stranger as we do oneself, because you were strangers, gerim, in the land of Egypt. So why is this there? I would argue, and I think all of us would probably agree, it's to evoke within us compassion and empathy. Because if we have that compassion and empathy, we're more likely to rise up and take action. If we can look in the eyes of the other and see, I have some familiarity with that suffering somewhere in my life, I can tap into that. I'm more likely to feel the pain that the prophets felt and rise up and act. So then in Deuteronomy 15:4-11, there's this very interesting conversation that goes on. On one hand, it tells us, there shall be no needy in your land. Right? No needy. But then it continues. And it says, but if there is a needy person, open your hand and care for the needy. And in fact, there will be always needy people in your land, because the people who wrote the Torah obviously understood the limitations of human generosity and human capacity and ability to create a society in which there are no needy. May we all live to see that day. So what I want to say about this is that acts of loving kindness, tzedakah, caring for the other, taking care of the needy, just like justice, truth, and peace, they are foundational to any ethical society. They are the foundation on which a society is built. But in Jewish theology, they are the floor on which we lead our lives and build a society. The ceiling is drastically more expansive and visionary, a society in which there shall be no needy. This is the Torah's explicit challenge to us to create a fundamentally different social order, one in which we care for the other, prioritize ethical and spiritual values, and place the well-being of others, even those we deem to be strangers, even those we hate, on the same plane as ourselves. And so then, of course, we have, as Deni brought already, B'Tselem Elohim. Every human being is created in the image of God. We also have the teaching that you shall be holy, you shall walk in God's path. And I love this quote from Shia Held. God wants Israel to create a society in which the weak and vulnerable are protected rather than exploited, loved rather than degraded. To do so is to walk in God's way and be holy. And in the phrase, you shall be holy, it's in the plural, right? So that is, you as a collective society shall be holy. It's not only a requirement of us as individuals. We must act and live in holy ways and see the divine in others. And we must, as a society, create a holy society. Individual holiness is bound up with societal holiness, or we could say in modern parlance, thanks to the feminist movement, the personal is political. So we have these ethical principles that work on this general level, and then we have halakhic principles. And again, returning to Berkowitz, Halakhah must give priority to the ethical demand. And I'm just going to read Slovakian again. And I'm probably not totally following my thing here, but you'll just stick with me, hopefully. Slovakian wrote, halakhic man's most fervent desire is the perfection of the world under the dominion of righteousness and loving kindness. So the first halakhic principle that Deni brought in is protest. So we have a lot of traditions, even beginning in the Tanakh, of protest. Abraham to God with Saddam, the incredible acts of civil disobedience by Shifra and Puah. And then again, Moses and Aaron fall on their faces in the story of Korach, begging God not to just annihilate all the people. And then we have the 5 daughters of Zelophehad, who challenge Moses and protest their exclusion from inheritance. So we have a long history, even in the Torah, of protest. Reuven Kimmelman writes that the third century Palestinian rabbinic leadership declared unequivocally the human responsibility to protest to prevent any wrongdoing. And then we have the text that Deni brought, whoever has the ability to protest, limchot, against members of his household when they are doing something wrong but
Page
does not,
14.
thank you, is punished for the transgressions for the members of his household. One who can protest against the people of the town but does not do so is punished for the transgressions of the people of his town. And one who can protest against the entire world but does not is punished for the transgressions of the entire world. And so then, as Deni pointed out, Rambam goes into a long discussion of this. When are you supposed to protest? How are you supposed to do it? In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through all of that. But I will say, miraculously, he says, if you do not protest and you have power to do so, you are seized by their sin. And we see this in Egypt, right? Because the leadership demands passive compliance of people. When the leadership enacts unjust laws, it demands the passive compliance of people. And we saw the people rise up when Trump was blocking people from coming into the country. People did not remain compliant. They stood up. And in Pharaoh's time in Egypt, right, the Egyptians participated in the killing of Hebrew firstborn sons. So leadership is guilty, but our compliance and silence and failure to protest also means we're guilty, and we will be affected by the plagues of our times. So then there's this incredible teaching Rabbi Yehuda shed to Shmuel. Is that
Shmuel.
Shmuel, thank you.
It's
I don't
it's
think
the
it's on.
bottom of page 14.
Yeah.
And the top of page 15.
Yeah. Whoever stops his ears at the cry of the poor, he shall also cry himself, but shall not be heard. If you turn your back on the sufferings of others, your tears will not be heard. And then there's this amazing discussion that continues, and I'll just sum it up. Even the righteous are responsible for the sins of the wicked if they have the capacity to protest or cry and neglect to do so. Why? Because while the Holy One knows that their protest would have been ineffective, those of us who are living, those of us who are righteous, we don't know. We don't know if they'll be effective or not. So if you fail to protest or prevent a sin, you'll be wiped out because you neglected to do so. And Heschel sums this up so beautifully. Some are guilty, all are responsible. How much more time? Okay, great. So I'm going to jump ahead now because what I'm doing in the beginning of this is just laying out our collective responsibilities as Jews in the pews to protest, rebuke, stand up, speak truth to power. So what's the role of us? If that's the Jews in the pews and we're spiritual leaders, do we have a greater obligation? So to do that, I looked at, and now we're on page 17, the role of a rabbi or a Jewish spiritual leader. So the conservative movement lists only 14 roles of a rabbi. I'm not kidding you. And they're like, run the gamut from there's no way to embody 14 roles, but one of them includes a spiritual activist, a social change activist. The Reform movement says to be a Reformed Jew is to hear the voice of the prophets in our head, to be engaged in the ongoing work of Tikkun Olam, to strive to improve the world in which we live, and to be God's partner in standing up for the voiceless and fixing what is broken in our society. Our website, the Aleph website, states the mission of Aleph is to fully embrace a contemporary egalitarian Judaism as a profound spiritual practice and social transformer. I just want to add something that Zalman said, which is quite beautiful. In Integral Halakhah, Zalman lamented that sometimes he thinks people come to Jewish renewal services only because they enjoy it. He reminded us that our practice, this is a quote, must always reference the larger purpose of the Jewish people in the world, our commitment to God, and to what we call Tikkun Olam, to be agents of redemption. We must, quote, go beyond the limits of the old system so that we can, again, practice in a way that leads to transformation. And we must respond to the changing circumstances of modern times. In these modern times, approximately 9 million people die every year from hunger and hunger-related diseases. A child dies every 10 seconds from hunger. 426 million children live in conflict zones. 8 billionaires have more wealth than half the population. At this historical moment, I believe this historical moment demands that rabbis and spiritual leaders embody the ethical clarity and courage and action that our prophets modeled. If not now, when? I'll just end with some modern sources. Do I have another 2 minutes?
Oh, sure.
Thank you. So again, returning to Samuel Tamaris, he treated every rabbinic sermon as an opportunity to awaken his audience to the necessity of moral improvement. To be religious is never to be callous or indifferent, never to be self-satisfied. Looking at the world from God's perspective means living in the prophetic tradition, to give voice to those who live in silent agony, to eradicate injustice, to emulate God's compassion for human beings. I understand that we as spiritual leaders have complex roles. We have to balance the needs of our community and the needs of the world. Ordination programs, I would argue, must prioritize training that gives future spiritual leaders the skills and courage they need to engage in this paradigm shifting role. And I'll just end with a quote from Rabbi Jill Jacobs, which is right here. Rabbis must bring the thousands of years of accumulated Jewish wisdom to bear on these issues. This is what it means to be a religious leader. A religious leader does not stick to safe topics like Jewish unity and ritual practice, though they have their place too. A religious leader must take ethical stands on the hard issues of the moment and does so with integrity, with a strong basis in his or her religious tradition and out of love and passion for creating a more just world. Community members are looking for such leadership. We should provide it.
So we've seen three different frames on bringing ethics into the halachic process, and it's all halakha, it's all halicha, it's all how we live our lives with our tradition in the rear view mirror. Actually, for me, it's very much in the front view mirror also. But we're called to bring ethics into halakha, and as Kat mentioned, I think Deni mentioned also, this is not a paradigm shift. I mean, this is, you have classic halachists who speak those words, and so we stretch the boundaries a little bit about what we usually speak about in these kind of plenaries in order to bring these questions to us, for each of us in our own rabbinate, as we each have our own decisions. And I want to remember all of us to remember the wisdom that I've heard my beloved mentor, Rabbi Daniel Siegel, say over and over again, that there is no the halakha. He doesn't want to hear any of us saying the halakha said. No way. There are only halachists, and each of us speak with the tradition flowing through us. We each speak and write our halakhah for ourselves and our community. And as Jill taught us yesterday, centered in the three dimensions of being, in olam, shana, and nefesh, and world, person, and time. And so I think I'd love we want to hear your comments. There's a microphone up here. So those of you who want to ask for short questions of our speakers, and not discourses if possible. Although I see, I want to acknowledge the presence of my other core AOP halacha teacher in the room, who's Rabbi Sammy Barth, who I think wants to come up to the microphone. Without Rabbi Sammy's guidance and mentoring, I wouldn't be here speaking to you today. So
Right.
Thank you, Sammy. And Daniel, who I believe is on Zoom, but we can't see their faces. Maybe we can switch to see the group of people on Zoom. Oh, yeah, okay, great.
So a little unusually for me, this isn't in the arena of ritual or liturgy, but I was very engaged the last 2 years with a lot of the work that was undertaken by my wife, Karen, alaiha shalom, in the field of stakeholder capitalism. And I was intrigued by this way you spoke about bringing that perspective into corporate boards upon which you sit. But you spoke about that, but many of the companies where you might speak in that way, your voice comes from your covenantal commitment. There's a professor at Harvard she worked with, Michael Beer, who wrote extensively in the field. And I'm curious how you look to not only have your voice be present, but to seek to have a committed engagement in the covenant of stakeholder capitalism by having that value written into and embraced into corporate mission as core to the corporate undertaking, as Beer explores in his literature that an increasing number of companies are doing.
So one part of my work in this capstone was around the strategic thinking of a corporation and the strategic planning process that corporations go through. And I believe that an important step that should be done for corporations that's not always done or often done is to link the mission of the corporation to some aspect of tikkun olam. And interestingly enough, if you look at the origin of the modern corporation in the 19th century, when charters for corporations were given out at the state level, the notion was that a corporation was this entity that had certain rights like people. You could sue and be sued. You had legal liability protections. You had long life and longevity of the corporation. But the exchange was that the corporation was serving some public good. And what has happened over the last century plus is that that concept of the modern corporation has fallen away, and other bodies of law and principles have replaced it. So if in strategic planning, you can link the mission of the corporation to some aspect of tikkun olam, and that can be publicly stated, then I think the covenantal mindset gets linked to what you're trying to do to repair the world. So that's how I would see that playing out.
If you have a question, please come up and use the mic and say your name so the people on Zoom will hear you. The mic is on the chair there. Well, that was a question specifically to Alan.
Oh, okay. Hi, everybody. Most of you know me, Moshe Halfon, and I guess I could put my question to you all in one word: how? You know, kol hakavod to each of you in your own ways. I expected from Kat, or I expect from my colleagues here that we're already preaching to the converted, preaching to the choir about tikkun olam issues. My dilemma is that some of you know my background all over the map, but for many of us, and I'm phrasing this in a practical way. Certainly the halachic stuff you all gathered is very helpful and very insightful and could be used in a class, let's say in your shul, not say, instead of I'm going to get up and I'm going to preach from the pulpit about this issue, to say, let's have a discussion in ritual committee or with social action, and let's discuss how these things can be done. But I guess my biggest question is, as I look at renewal and I look at all of you, because I was ordained Reconstructionist, and then I became part of this community as well. But more and more, I am observing that I look around and I see a lot of you are no longer in the, whatever you want to call them, hippy-dippy renewal congregations that you founded, but a lot of us are taking jobs in more straight-laced congregations as cantors or rabbis, just like our colleagues in the Reconstructionist movement and the Reform. I've never in all my career been lucky enough to be in a congregation that supports or wants this kind of work. So my questions are, one, if we say that we have the right to do this, or we should get congregants involved in things, what's to prevent the other side, as they do, the evangelicals, the right-wing Jews and so on, say them going out and saying, well, we're going to do this. And then you have a dilemma, an argument. The second question is, again, the practical, how do you shift the window in the more, shall I say, straight-laced congregations? What they'll generally say is, oh, yes, Rabbi, you have freedom of the pulpit, but don't you dare talk about this. So it's just, how do you do it? So I'll leave it there. You can all talk amongst yourselves.
I think that remains a question.
I could just, yeah. So I could just say that my hope is that having a halakhic argument that you can speak politics from the pulpit gives you power in your negotiations and in your conversations when people say, no, don't talk about this or that. That there are moral principles in our Torah that teach us how to live and how to preach.
See, before I address this to Deni, just two things. One, I really invite people to come to the Tikkun Olam.
This is David J. Cooper.
Oh, thank you. And I still am. Invite people to the Tikkun Olam plenary this evening, which will continue some of these issues. And also I'll be doing a thing tomorrow afternoon that will extend some of the things that you said, Kat, into the issues concerning Israel-Palestine. But to Deni, I was thinking when you were speaking about the situation of Ralph Northam, the governor of Virginia, who turned out at the very beginning of his governorship, or just before he assumed it, that he had put on blackface at some point in the past. And I remember there was a big outcry that he should resign from his governorship. And I was thinking maybe they should now keep him as governor, because he's going to have to bend over backward to do a kind of a teshuvah. And I think actually did. Did you consider anything about his situation and how that the different responses were to that?
Well, I didn't at the time, but I want to say that this issue of cancel culture is not just what I spoke about. It definitely includes things such as someone having done something stupid when they were, in the fraternity or whatever, and then many, many years later, they may be a totally different person. It's not necessarily wrong that those facts are out there, but to shame someone, but to not allow that person to be seen as the person they are today, and for him, as he did, to take accountability and then move forward. Yes. And I think that's all part of this conversation. There's also Lair House in the West Coast did a meeting, a group like this, and it was online as well, about different kinds of cancel culture. Should we not listen to I'm blanking. No, I was talking about, well, yeah, but I'm talking about who's the incredible German Wagner. Thank you. Should we not listen to Wagner because he was a terrible anti-Semite, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Should we cancel out things from the past as well? So those are all different issues. But what you brought up is certainly relevant. How do we help people move on from things they may have done a long time ago, but into the person, and how do we help see them as the person they are today without just necessarily burying things under the rug?
Hi, everybody. I'm Cantor Paul Bush. Thank you all for your brilliant presentations. I want to address directly to Rabbi Marshall, because what your topic centers on speaks directly to something that I'm dealing with right now in my community, which is a group who has been distributing anti-Jewish hate literature on people's driveways under the cover of night. And it was prevalent in our local community going back to July, but has just begun to be centered very close to the synagogue and is affecting our members. And responses to that are complex. One of the local communities, the mayor refused to raise it in a public forum, even though he was encouraged to do so by his council members, for fear that that would elevate the status. I don't believe in my own heart that those were his only motivations for remaining silent. But a different situation is occurring really as we speak. At tonight's council meeting in my own town, members of the council are specifically going to raise this issue and propose a council resolution specifically condemning these sorts of actions. I think that's a relatively constructive response. There's also some energy, since we all see on Nextdoor, Facebook, whatever social media, how easy it is to see a lost dog running by your house or a porch pirate, that a campaign be started for people to turn on their security cameras towards their driveways and start to identify these people who remain in the shadows. So I wanted, maybe you could speak about how are both approaches appropriate? Is there always a balanced approach? Is maybe possibly shaming people who are distributing hate literature an appropriate or a justifiable response, along with positive community building responses?
That's a really good question. I don't think that any of the things you said really fit into the negative canceling or shaming, because it wasn't saying, well, you know, call out who you think came by and did that. It was giving good solution, put the cameras out there, let the cameras speak for it. And then when you get that evidence, you don't throw that on social media, you take it to the police. And
The challenge is it's not illegal.
oh,
So there's not
got it.
police response
Got it.
that is legally justified at this point.
Got it. So that, well, so first of all, the other thing about the mayor is somebody going to face confront the mayor.
The other mayor is out of the picture. Our own mayor.
You probably have to move on.
All right.
Okay.
No, we can
sorry.
move on. So thank you for your feedback.
So,
Yeah. I'll let you-
I just want to commend people to the work of Nobel laureate Marie Ressa. Anybody who's read her autobiography, it really speaks to this issue of, from a public ethical point of view, regarding social media, and really the good might not outweigh the bad.
So I had a question for Rabbi Allen. I'm just wondering about the aptness, or lack of it, of the covenantal model in the relationship between patients and corporations, because my understanding of covenant is that it has to involve agreement on both sides. And the relationship between a medical patient in need of life-saving medication and a corporation is a non-consensual model. I believe if you asked most patients, would you like to be in a relationship where, in order to get your life-saving medication, off your back has to come a huge profit to people whose only merit is having lots of money? Probably most of them would say no. So how can you still feel like covenantal model would be applicable?
Well, I think that the corporation, the pharmaceutical company, brings the medication to the market. I think your point is an interesting one for me to consider about the consensual nature of a relationship. I think the point that I try and make is it's the mindset that's the important consideration in the boardroom, because it's the mindset toward the other stakeholder that pushes one to think about balancing the interests and the needs of a patient against the profitability of the corporation. And there, I don't think you necessarily need a consensual relationship to be thinking about how to put the patient first, or how to put the patient more at the center of the thought process there.
Okay, we're going to have to close this up because it is just about 1:45 and the next session begins on the hour. And so thank you very much to our panelists, and grab them and talk to them more about their specific topics.
Denise, is there something that you wanted to get our attention about? There are I don't know whether we can save the chat somehow and we can maybe post it on, yeah. Anyway, thank everybody for being here. And this was meant to begin a discussion and to peak a discussion as opposed to give you definite conclusions. And I apologize to those who wanted to speak. So.